something weird about this conference. I always bring a written paper here. I don't know why. It's a reaction against the environment. So the other day I was working with a very respected educator in the democratic education field, and I was involved in an email exchange with him. And I made a suggestion that we might use a particular tool like Moodle to sort something out, to help solve a problem. And I got the weirdest reply. This leading educator who is concerned with social, economic, technological change said to me, and I will click this in the hope that it changes. There we go. He said, and I underscore it as he did, he said, "I loathe technology." Now, my first response really was to point out that he was actually using email, which was, in theory, technology. But then it struck me that he wasn't actually talking about technology. He wasn't talking about tools. It wasn't a response to a particular technology. He was reacting against what he saw as a whole way of educating that he sees as being symbolized by digital technologies. And I think it's worth talking about what he saw. He saw technology as not being about the sorts of things that we're talking about at this conference. He saw it as being the instrument that's underpinned performance management tables, league tables, the reduction of educational practice to point scoring, to the point that our government even states in its opening section of the white paper that the purpose of education is to get higher on a league table that is designed by economists, in which we know significant numbers of countries cheat. That's the quality of educational debate we have today. This guy also saw technology as the rise of surveillance systems like CCTV in schools that tend, by and large, to further marginalize and victimize those children who are already marginalized and victimized in schools. He saw technology as the encroachment of screens into all areas of children's lives, as the panacea used to justify our failure to provide safe public spaces for young people and to justify our exclusion of them from our city streets. He saw technology as a reduction of teacher professionalism and identity. A former colleague of mine, Dan Such, for example, took a photograph at BET a couple of years ago of a sign that said, "No time to prepare your lesson, download them here." He saw technology as part of an endless drive to efficiency, control, standardization, and the loss of interpersonal relationships. He saw the growth of technology-mediated online platforms as the beginning of the drive to radically individualize and privatize education, as a development of the delivery of efficient learning to the individual wherever they might be. And he saw technology as representing massive environmental costs, waste, and profligate use of resources. Now, the consequence of this view of technology in education from democratic educators and others is that when they read a government white paper that fails to mention technology, that reinforces the value of teachers, that says it's teaching and learning that matters, these democratic educators who put human relationships at the heart of education may celebrate. And yet, when we look at the history of educational technology, that's not what it's been about for many of us. Many of us came into this sector. Many of us still work in this field because we believe in the potential of digital technologies to be used to bring people together. We believe that it has the potential to enhance our humanity, to allow us to think together, learn together, and work together. For the last 10 years, however, many of us have felt that we need to make the case for using digital technologies by positioning them as an essential part of what it means to prepare schools, young people, and society for the knowledge economy, for the growth of international competition in goods and services, for the cutthroat world of globalization. We may have wanted to bring digital technologies in because we thought that they could support collaboration, communication, and learning, but we often hid this under a veneer that allowed politicians and policymakers to easily co-opt digital technology into a story about modernization and economic competition. And in so doing, the story that's been told has often been used to describe those democratic educators that we might work with as out of touch or in the way of progress. And so a divide has been driven between many of the people working in educational technology and many of the people working in democratic and cooperative education, despite the fact that we may have many goals in common. Now, this might seem simply as a disagreement amongst friends, we can overlook it. I disagree. I think that that divide is profoundly unhelpful if we are serious about creating education systems that are going to help our kids survive the 21st century. The divide between what you might call the sort of humanist educators for democracy and cooperation and the sort of technology advocates for democracy and cooperation impoverishes both sides. We stop learning from each other. But more importantly, this divide, it creates a divide that allows those who would simply say that education is about the individual to drive right through it. It allows those who would simply say that education is a private good, a scarce resource to be competed over, to dominate the argument. While those of us who recognise that learning, education, and long-term well-being cannot be achieved by a focus on the individual alone, are fighting with each other about whether we should use technology or not. And I want to suggest that this divide can't be continued. It can't be allowed to continue because, frankly, unless we harness all of our talents, expertise, and experience to work out how we build education systems that support cooperation and collaboration and democracy, we're going to be in trouble over the next 20 years. I want to look just at 4 major developments that we can expect. These will require education to be understood as developing a shared public good, not just building individual attainment. So let's start with the technological. When we look at the technological trends over the next 20 years, the major issues we're looking at relate to learning to live with a connectivity that we have never had before. We're looking at the development of a digital layer overlaying the physical landscape. We're looking at the creation of large-scale complex systems of systems. We're looking at the evolution of massive non-human-like intelligence. The biggest challenge that we face over the next 20 years is going to be learning how to harness, collaborate with, and learn with each other and with our machines. We need a curriculum for collective and collaborative intelligence. Without it, the complexity of the systems that we're working with will already radically outstrip our capacity to understand, manage, and work with them. Let's also look at the economic landscape that we can look forward to. It is, I would argue, pretty clear by now that the idea of the universally beneficial knowledge economy, in which the harnessing of individual creativity will lead to the flourishing of endless growth and universal wealth, is an insidious lie that obscures the massive and radically increasing inequalities within countries and between countries. It obscures the trend towards the casualisation of employment, including middle-class employment. It obscures the radical insecurity of employment and the massive polarisation that we are seeing develop, that sees the growth of a global elite while millions are dispossessed. If you're not convinced about this, you only have to look at David Ashton, Hugh Lauder, and Phil Brown's work on studies of multinational companies to see the trends we're moving towards in terms of high skills and low wage economies. We need education systems that allow us to work out how to build resilient economic practices. We can also think about the demographic map of the next century. It's unprecedented. We're entering globally a century of maturity. We're looking at 1 million centenarians in the UK by the end of this century alone. By 2030, we're looking at half the population being aged over 50. And with this comes massive readjustments in our understanding of the relationship between generations. In the UK, the flashpoints are around housing. In Germany and France, they're around employment. In many countries, they're around education. And we're starting to see, as part of this debate, education positioned as a private good, a personal benefit, rather than a public good. This is a surefire sign that the intergenerational contract is cracking. But without this contract, we can expect the most vulnerable to suffer, the weakest elderly, the most vulnerable children, suffer when we no longer have a collective reciprocal relationship between investing in our young and caring for our old. Our education systems have to do more, therefore, than simply teach the young. They need to break out of their age ghettos and start trying to build real relationships across generations. And then, of course, we can look at the environmental landscape of the next century, a landscape that increasingly looks like one that brings the most serious political choices about how we as individuals, communities and nations will respond to the challenge of adapting to climate disruption. How will we respond to significant numbers of refugees, to constraints on food and water supply, to the massive infrastructure projects that will be required for adaptation? We urgently need, again, to find the way to build public spaces where we can have these discussions, where we can come together and learn together how to act and to respond. In the light of all these developments, we cannot simply continue to sell children the lie that the first-class degree from Harvard, Cambridge, or wherever it might be will in fact guarantee their long-term security and well-being. We cannot continue to think that simply if we just get the teaching and learning strategies right, if we just bring the right tools in to engage kids, if we can just get them through the next century of exams, we'll somehow immunize them against the disruptions of the 21st century. We need to recognize the insanity of thinking that educational success is simply about rescuing children from the bigotry of low expectations. We need to recognize the arrogance of the idea of the hero educator dropping into the school to rescue the talented child from the dysfunctional community, an educational approach that does more to destroy communities than to build them. Instead, we need to start asking the much harder question of how education reconfigures itself to building resilient communities. Now, to do that, I come back to the guy that I was working with. To do that, we need to rebuild the bridges with the educators, community activists, researchers, and youth workers who have centuries of experience in building education that is engaged with its communities and seeks to build them up. Now, there is so much work going on in these fields from which we can learn. There are cooperative education movements with over 150 years' experience and schools across the world tackling everything from transport logistics in Uganda to community businesses in Stockport. The UK now has nearly 180 cooperative schools and growing. There is a democratic education movement that brings at least 200 networks across the world that's developing real public spaces in which students, teachers, and communities can debate and act upon real problems. And that sort of working on real problems is really, I think, what some of the presentations were talking about this morning in terms of really bringing computer science or whatever else it might be back in. It's about working on real problems. There's the small schools movement that is placing human relationships at the heart of education and offering new models of organising time, space, and school community relationships. There's the sustainable schools movement that is about building local resilience and educational justice collectives in the US, where schools, universities, and communities, again, are collaborating to build real knowledge to change their students' and communities' lives for the better. Now, if we want to build bridges with these movements, we cannot dismiss the resistance to technology use that we find in some of these groups as merely being the result of fear or being stuck in the past. Instead, we need to acknowledge some of the unintended consequences of our advocacy of technology for the last 10 years. We need to recognize that some of the ways technology have been used have led to practices that have been anathema to democracy, humanity, and sustainability. And we need to look these square in the face and try to find ways of countering them. At the same time, we also need to put our values up front and make clear that we have answers to the questions that democratic educators are asking. And the questions they're asking are, how do your technologies help us build human solidarity, kindness, and support? How do your technologies enable real debate with communities about how to build secure futures? How do your technologies help communities and students to think long-term about their futures and to build maps of their assets and resources? We have got in our community, in the education technology community, we have got good answers to these questions. And there are projects that are beginning to demonstrate them. But we need to start shouting about them. And perhaps if we do start shouting about those projects, and if we are clear about those values, perhaps when we do that, if one government decides to actively sideline the digital in education, we might find more people lining up to support us. Indeed, we might find ourselves supporting, allied with, and supported by a growing, powerful, and important set of movements that are looking not only to rethink education, but to rethink and rebuild the world. Thank you.